In December 1941, the rising sun over Pearl Harbor marked an indelible moment in aviation history. 6 Japanese aircraft carriers cut through the waves at dawn, carrying more than 350 aircraft. When the first bombs fell on Oahu, the world entered a new era, according to the U.S. Navy Damage Assessment 1,942. The Japanese lost 29 aircraft, in exchange for 347 American planes destroyed or rendered inoperative. That number was not merely a tactical victory, but proof, in the eyes of the Imperial Japanese Navy General Staff, that their air doctrine had reached perfection. From Hawaii to Luzon, from Malaya to Darwin, the whirlwind of zeros spread swiftly. According to the Imperial Army Operations Record, 1,942, in the Philippines, Japan lost only 7 aircraft, while 103 American planes were shot down. At Darwin, the figures were 2 versus 30. An average kill ratio of 10-1 led commanders to believe that victory was inevitable. In reports sent to Tokyo, the phrase, absolute air superiority, was repeated like a declaration. Many pilots wrote in their diaries, "No one in the world can touch us in the sky." And on sweltering afternoons in Rabaul, as the sun sank behind the palms, they raised cups of sake, convinced that their empire had truly mastered the skies of the Pacific. Yet the roots of that confidence lay in a peculiar design philosophy. Horikoshi Jiro, regarded as the father of the Zero, wrote in his memoirs that he believed no armor, no excess weight, only harmony between man and machine. The Zero was built using extra super duralumin, an alloy 30% lighter than standard American aircraft aluminum. It had no pilot armor, no self-sealing fuel tanks, and even radios were often removed to save weight. According to the Technical Bureau of the Imperial Navy Report, 1,941, the Zero could reach a speed of 565 kilometers per hour, a ceiling of 10,000 meters, and a range of 3,000 kilometers, twice that of contemporary American aircraft. Flying with the Zero is like wearing wings, pilot Hiroyoshi Nishizawa wrote in his journal. In their minds, victory came from spirit and skill, not from metal and wiring. Japan's training system at the time was considered the most sophisticated in the world. To become a Navy pilot, cadets had to complete 3 years of training, accumulating at least 700 flight hours. The Army required 500 hours. The program emphasized physical sense, meaning control by instinct rather than instruments. Simulated exercises in night flying, evasive maneuvers, and close-range dogfights were practiced until reflexes became instinctive. At the Kasumigara base, young trainees bowed before the national flag, vowing to turn their bodies into weapons. Instructors demanded that they feel gravity, the wind, and the vibration of the fuselage. A veteran pilot could sense an enemy behind him solely by changes in cockpit pressure. According to the Naval Flight Training Manual, 1,941, Japan regarded this ability as proof of a sacred fighting spirit, something they believed Americans could never comprehend. However, beneath those dazzling numbers lay a fundamental flaw in Japan's approach to warfare. When Horikoshi was asked about the Zero's bullet resistance, he merely smiled. If a bullet hits, it means the pilot has already failed. That statement reflected the entire military philosophy of the time. Victory depended on individual skill, not systems. According to the Imperial Navy Staff Analysis, 1,942, each Zero pilot was considered a modern samurai, turning battle into art. They mocked American planes as flying trucks, heavy, thick, and crude in design. While Japan was training pilots to become artists, America was turning pilots into components of an industrial machine. In Washington, the first reports about the Zero caused shock. When a captured A6M from the Aleutians arrived at Wright Field in 1942, American engineers were astonished by its power-to-weight ratio. One engineer exclaimed, "Impossible, they stripped away everything just to fly faster." In the conference rooms of Grumman, whiteboards filled with formulas began to appear. The Americans had no intention of replicating the Zero. They wanted to build something that could destroy it. Meanwhile, in Tokyo, the War Ministry believed the enemy was drowning in despair, that each new American aircraft design was a sign of weakness. By the end of 1942, Japan controlled most of the Pacific. From Singapore to Truk Lagoon, every flight path was within its reach. Data from Combined Fleet Report No. 981942 recorded that Japanese air forces achieved an average victory ratio of 9-8-1, holding absolute dominance in every naval campaign. In the command rooms at Yokosuka, maps were covered with small red flags. Each flag represented a captured airfield, a wiped-out squadron. Laughter filled the air as young officers reported yet another victory, and in that laughter the seeds of defeat were already sown. When faith turns into dogma, every warning is ignored. Veteran pilot Saburo Sakai, who survived more than 200 aerial battles, later wrote in his memoir, "We believed we were invincible, but in the sky, no one remains invincible forever." The last sunlight spread across Rabaul Airfield, glinting off the silver wings of the Zeros. The roar of Nakajima Sakai engines thundered like the drums of an empire at the height of its power. Yet within that sound, there was a faint silence, one that no one could hear. And in that silence, the downfall had already begun. After the Battle of Midway, secret meetings in Washington took place under a heavy atmosphere. Pilots returning from Coral Sea and Midway spoke of the enemy as if of a predator that could not be touched. "The Zero can circle us 3 times before we even manage to aim," an officer of VF-2 wrote in a report to the Navy Department. According to Fighter Evaluation Report No. 81942, the loss ratio between the Wildcat and the Zero at that time was 1-5. Every battle was the same, Wildcats bursting into flames mid-air, while Zeros disappeared into the clouds like ghosts. America understood that if it did not change, it would lose control of the Pacific sky. The answer was found at a small Grumman factory in Bethpage, New York. Under the dim yellow lights of the workshop, young engineers gathered around a whiteboard covered with formulas. At their center stood Leroy Grumman, the company's founder, his hands still stained with oil from the last prototype test. He tapped his pencil against the F4F Wildcat blueprint and said quietly, "We don't need a skinny cat, we need a Hellcat." That idea would later become its official name, F6F Hellcat. The first goal of the program was to create an aircraft that could survive in the situations where the Wildcat had failed. The Navy demanded 3 criteria: withstand bullets, be easy to repair, and be easy to mass produce. The engineering team started with a stronger airframe structure, using thicker steel and aluminum alloys, adding armor around the cockpit and fuel tanks. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, previously tested on the P-47 Thunderbolt, was chosen for its durability in all conditions, according to the U.S. Navy Aircraft Requirement Memo, August 1942. The initial requirement was merely to increase pilot survival rate by 40%. No one expected it would create a machine that would redefine the entire doctrine of aerial combat. When the prototype rolled onto the test runway in early 1943, many pilots could not believe its size. The Hellcat weighed 12,186 pounds, twice the A6M Zero's 5,800 pounds, carrying 6 Browning M2, 50 calories machine guns, along with 212 pounds of armor protecting the pilot and oil system. Its self-sealing fuel tank held 250 gallons of gasoline, enough for a 1,500 kilometers range. In Japanese intelligence reports obtained through Sweden, officers described the Hellcat as a flying battleship, an insult to the concept of a fighter plane. At Rabaul airfields, Japanese pilots mockingly called it Bakusan, meaning bomb plane. Oh. But behind that heavy block of metal was a philosophy opposite to Horikoshi Jiro's. While the Japanese believed victory belonged to pilots with pure hearts, the Americans believed victory belonged to systems that could compensate for human error. The Hellcat was not designed for geniuses. It was made so that average pilots could defeat aces. The R2800 engine produced 2,000 horsepower, enough thrust to climb 3,500 feet per minute, with thick wings for stability at low speeds, and a frame that could endure 13 G without breaking. The cockpit was arranged according to the idiot-proof principle, meaning that even in chaos, every switch was exactly where it needed to be. According to the U.S. Naval Aviation Test Report, February 1943, a test pilot stated, "If you make a mistake, the Hellcat will save you. If you're right, it will kill the enemy." Grumman also completely revolutionized production methods. Each Hellcat was divided into 8 modules: wings, mid-fuselage, tail, engine frame, cockpit, landing gear, control surfaces, and armament. Workers were trained to assemble each module separately, then combine them on the main assembly line. This process was called modular assembly, a concept unprecedented in aviation manufacturing. When a component failed, it could be removed and replaced within 60 minutes. This mechanism allowed the Hellcat to operate continuously as fleets moved thousands of nautical miles. According to the War Production Board Report, 1944, on average, Grumman completed 1 Hellcat every 60 minutes, the fastest production rate of any fighter aircraft in U.S. Navy history. Workers at Bethpage often recalled that in the winter of 1942, snow covered the transport rails, yet the factory lights stayed on all night. They called that shift the midnight shift for Midway, as a way to repay the blood debt of their fallen comrades. Each time a completed Hellcat was rolled off the line, the factory siren wailed. Some workers paused, looking at the metallic body gleaming under sodium lights, whispering, "Let's see if this one brings them home." Oh, Ben, the most profound difference between the two philosophies lies in purpose. Japan built the Zero so that the best men could fight to the death. America built the Hellcat so that anyone who survived could return. According to the Naval Aeronautics Statistical Digest, 1945, the survival rate per mission of Hellcat pilots was 5 times higher than that of Wildcat pilots. And because of that, they could learn, improve, and return to the skies with new experiences. By mid-1943, the first Hellcats left Alameda Harbor, shrouded in morning fog and the scent of metallic paint. Engineers watched through factory windows as they were loaded onto the carrier USS Essex. They did not know whether the Hellcat would truly be able to face the Zero. But a young engineer, holding his flight cap, whispered amid the sound of engines starting up, "This time, it's their turn to fear." Oh. The sound of the R-2800 engine thundered through the hangar, deep and heavy like a drum announcing the return of a power. The Hellcat had not yet seen battle, but just by looking at the cold metal curve of its nose, one could tell a new era had begun. And in that rising roar, America was learning how to win by building, not believing. On the morning of the 30th of September 1943, the sky over Marcus Island was as clear as a sheet of new paper. Petty Officer Yoshio Fukui was leading a small escort formation for a reconnaissance plane on a simple mission: observe the American fleet. To the east, the sun reflected off the waves, the glare through the cockpit glass making him squint. In his report to the Combined Fleet Air Staff, he wrote, "Spotted 6 flying objects heading southeast, possibly B-25 seconds or medium bombers." But a few seconds later, he noticed something unusual. Those planes did not have the long, slender silhouettes of bombers. They had short fuselages, thick wings, and cockpit canopies bulging like beasts crouching before a strike. Fukui tilted his control stick and pulled his Zero into a familiar dive, a maneuver that had saved his life in 23 sorties. According to Imperial Navy Combat Report No. 2041943, it was his first encounter with the F6F Hellcat. "When I dived, they did not scatter, did not turn, but stood straight up into the sky," he wrote. The Hellcat climbed vertically at 3,500 feet per minute, its R-2800 engine roaring like metal grinding the air itself. Fukui tried to follow, but his airspeed indicator dropped rapidly, the G-force pressing his body down like lead. At 15,000 feet, the Zero began to shake violently. We lost momentum, and it fell on me like a stone. The Hellcat flipped over, dove, and 6 Browning M, 2 guns fired in unison. Fukui heard the airframe crack and saw the warning light flash crimson. In his post-battle report, he wrote, "My plane took 17 bullets in 3 seconds. Only by spinning the aircraft into a free-fall spiral did he escape the burst. When he landed, his comrades asked, 'Did you shoot any down?' Fukui looked at the bullet-riddled fuselage and replied, 'I was luckier than the others. I made it back.' Oh. The others included Petty Officer Masao Kameda, who did not return. His Zero was torn apart over the sea, not a single fragment recovered. Together with the reconnaissance plane, they were the first losses caused by the Hellcat. That afternoon on Marcus Island, mechanics silently dismantled Fukui's battle-damaged aircraft. The dark circular holes across the silver metal skin looked like a strange kind of writing. "The Americans have changed," one lieutenant said. "They no longer play by our rules." Less than a week later, on the 5th of October 1943, the sky over Wake Island was ablaze. 12 Zeros of the 252nd Air Group were ordered to intercept a formation of F6F Hellcats, escorting the bombers of Task Force 14. At 20,000 feet, the air was thin and eerily still. According to the operational diary of Lieutenant Yoshio Shiga, the Japanese squadron held the advantage: altitude, position, and surprise. As they dived, 20mm cannons tore through the sky like a storm of steel. "We have the absolute advantage," Shiga recorded in his flight log. "They are right below us, slow and heavy." But every calculation was wrong. The Hellcats did not scatter to avoid fire. They maintained a triangular formation, groups of 3, slowing down to preserve energy. Japanese shells struck their fuselages without igniting any fires. "Their armor is thicker than we thought," Shiga wrote. "When we ran out of ammunition and climbed, they turned back, rose higher, then dove like hunting birds. The battle lasted 10 minutes. The result: 8 Zeros shot down, while not a single Hellcat was lost. According to the US. Navy After-Action Report VF5, 1943. In one attack alone, American pilots destroyed 70% of the enemy force. One survivor, forced to crash land on the island, recalled seeing a human-shaped ball of fire plunging into the sea. When asked how it felt, he said, "I didn't see the enemy. I only saw fire coming from every direction." From those 2 battles, the Imperial Navy began to realize what it once deemed impossible. The Zero's maneuverability advantage was gone. The Hellcat did not turn or chase. It climbed straight into the sky and unleashed its firepower from above. "We called it energy fighting," Lieutenant Commander Tanamizu explained after the war. "The Hellcat used gravity as a weapon, and we fought against it." At 25,000 feet, the Hellcat's R2800 engine still produced 1,650 horsepower, while the Zero's Nakajima Sakai had only 900. With every encounter, the altitude advantage tilted further toward the Americans. According to the Imperial Navy Tactical Review 1943, Japanese pilots were advised to avoid engaging Hellcats above 15,000 feet, but in the chaos of battle, that order meant nothing. What puzzled Japanese officers most was the way the Hellcats moved. "They don't fight like humans," wrote a report from the 204th Air Group. "They act like machines." Pilots described opponents who maintained constant speed, never panicked, never reacted by instinct. When a Zero suddenly rolled to bait them, the Hellcat simply climbed, waited for the enemy to lose energy, then dove and fired with mathematical precision, as if in a simulator. "Every move they make is mathematics," one officer exclaimed during a briefing at Rabaul. "We don't understand how they calculate, we just see ourselves dying." News of the first defeats spread quickly across the bases at Truk and Palau. In a mechanic's diary appeared a trembling line: "The Americans truly have a Hellcat." Meanwhile, in Washington, Grumman received reports on the F6F's performance. In a telegram to the Navy Department dated the 20th of October 1943, he wrote, "Pilots say they trust this aircraft as they trust their comrades. That trust would become the foundation for the total reversal of Japan's air superiority." As October ended, Marcus and Wake were just small dots on the map, but their meaning reached far beyond geography. In 2 months, the mocking smiles of Japanese pilots had vanished, replaced by silence in the tactical briefing rooms. They understood that the Zero's era was ending, the Pacific sky was beginning to change color, and in that silence, Japan's wings began to break. As 1943 entered its climax, the skies over the Pacific were no longer a stage for lone pilots. It was the age of machines, of mathematics, and of systems. According to the U.S. Navy Combat Air Direction Report 1944, every Hellcat sortie was guided by shipborne radar with a detection range of up to 50 miles. On the carriers of Task Force 58, round screens flickered with dots, each dot marking an enemy formation just after takeoff. The control officer on the command deck merely read out the coordinates, and the Hellcat pilots in the air immediately adjusted heading, speed, and altitude. The war was now measured by radio frequencies, not instinct. Meanwhile, the Japanese still flew by sight. "We were ordered to see with our souls," Lieutenant Takeshi Aramaki wrote in his diary, "but the soul cannot see through clouds." They searched for enemies with strained eyes after hours of flight, while the Americans had already spotted them 50 miles away. On the radar screen of the USS Enterprise, whenever an unfamiliar signal appeared, a dry voice echoed through the control room. "Bogey bearing 115, altitude 12,000, vector 270. Below deck, the squadron commander tapped the map and ordered the ready group to launch. In less than 5 minutes, the Hellcats were positioned exactly along the enemy's flight path. According to the 9th Fleet Air Control Summary, 1944, 87% of air engagements during this period began with radar detection. The organization of formations was itself a revolution. Previously, U.S. pilots usually flew in 3-plane teams, but by mid-1943, they switched to 4-plane groups divided into 2 high-low pairs. Each pair consisted of 1 aircraft flying high and 1 low, maintaining constant radio contact. When the enemy attacked the lower plane, the upper one would dive from the Sunday, fighting as a machine. Japanese pilots called it in the report of the 204th Air Group. Each Hellcat no longer fought alone, but as a link in a massive aerial killing machine. On the shared frequency, American pilots spoke in clipped phrases, "Blue 2, check 6, Roger, clear." The coordination was so smooth that the Japanese thought they were using computers. They knew where we were, how high we were, which way we were flying. Lieutenant Colonel Saburo Tanamizu admitted after the war. "We were still samurai, but they had become engineers." At the same time, the training gap widened. According to the Imperial Navy Pilot Training Report, 1944, the average training time for Japanese naval pilots had fallen to 200–300 hours due to shortages of fuel and training aircraft. Each pilot received only 50 rounds of ammunition, most practiced shooting on land, and few ever fired live rounds in the air. One cadet wrote in a letter home, "I fired 6 rounds. The gun jammed. They told me not to fix it, to save bullets." In contrast, American pilots had to complete at least 300 hours before deployment, including 50 hours in the actual combat aircraft. Each fired an average of 2,000 training rounds and practiced hundreds of takeoffs and landings on wooden decks, simulating carrier flight operations, according to U.S. Naval Training Center statistics. 1944, takeoff and landing error rates decreased by 65% compared to the previous year. When the Hellcat entered combat, that difference became a matter of life and death. A Japanese pilot entered battle with less than 1% of the live fire experience of his American counterpart. At Rabaul, commanders realized the quality of pilots was declining at an alarming rate. They requested longer training, but fuel was scarce and time had run out. While the U.S. produced 35,000 fighter aircraft per year, Japan managed only 5,100, most destined for land-based fronts. The disparity in weaponry widened the gap even further. The Hellcat carried 6 Browning M2, 50 calories machine guns, with a combined rate of fire of 4,500 rounds per minute, each round generating 3,000 500 foot-pounds of energy. The Zero had only two 7.7mm guns, each round averaging 750 foot-pounds. An American pilot once said in a press interview, "When you pull the trigger, you feel the plane shake, like the whole beast is roaring." The Hellcat's frame was reinforced with 212 pounds of armour, protecting the pilot and oil system. In tests by the Naval Ordnance Lab, 1943, the aircraft remained controllable after being hit by more than 100 rounds of 7.7mm fire. That resilience gave pilots a rare sense of security. "We knew we could make it home," said Lieutenant Roy Rushing, "and when you believe that, you fight differently." The Hellcat was also a symbol of organisation. On every carrier, engineers logged every flight hour and mechanical fault, sending the data to a central analysis centre at Pearl Harbor. According to the Fleet Maintenance Summary, 1944, 96% of Hellcats could return to service within 24 hours after sustaining damage. Each aircraft was a node in a massive statistical system where data was analysed to improve survival rates, fuel efficiency, and combat performance. This was the first true data war in aviation history. On the battlefield, that reality showed through in numbers. The Hellcat achieved a survival rate 5 times higher than the Zero, according to the U.S. Navy Air Combat Intelligence Division, 1944. The pilots who returned were not lone heroes but living software updates for the war machine. Every report, every gun camera reel was archived, analysed, and turned into training manuals for the next squadron. By the end of 1943, victory was no longer a story of individuals. It was the precise synchronization of radar, radio, training, and logistics. Japan believed that the soldiers' spirit could surpass steel, but in the Pacific, spirit began to lose to engineering. In a meeting at Yokosuka, one officer whispered to his comrades, "We fight with our hearts, they fight with numbers." Across the midnight sea, the radar beeps aboard the USS Essex pulsed steadily. In the sky, Hellcat lights swept through thin clouds, pairs flying together like gears in a vast machine. On the other side, Japanese pilots still took off into the darkness, guided only by their eyes and faith. And in that rhythm of beeps and voices, the age of the machine had truly begun. By mid-1944, the air war over the Pacific had been completely transformed. Instead of one-on-one duels, the sky was now divided into radar grids, where each mission became a calculation. According to the U.S. Navy Air Operations Summary, 1944, an average American air raid mobilized more than 450 Hellcats, coordinated through a vast radio network with the fleet below. At sea, dots of light moved rhythmically across radar screens, and within those moving dots, the future of Japan's air power was disappearing. The Formosa campaign, in October 1944, marked the beginning of the collapse. Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, commander of the Second Air Fleet, was ordered to deploy all remaining forces in Taiwan to prevent the American fleet from advancing toward the Philippines. More than 700 aircraft were mobilized, most of them A6M Zeros and G4M Bettys. On the evening of October 15, Radio Tokyo broadcast an excited announcement. 26 enemy carriers and warships sunk, 300 American aircraft shot down. But what aired on the radio was victory only in imagination. According to the U.S. Navy Battle Damage Report, 1944, total American losses were just 89 aircraft and 2 ships lightly damaged. Japan, in contrast, lost 329 planes, along with nearly all its remaining veteran pilots. Pilot Tatsuo Ichimaru, one of the few survivors, recalled in his memoir, "We took off without knowing we were flying into a net." The Hellcats were waiting at multiple altitudes, guided by shipborne radar to each incoming group. Many young Japanese pilots, some with barely 200 hours of training, charged straight into the Hellcat formations and were shot down before they could even fire. At Tainan Air Base, once roaring with engines, only a few charred skeletons of aircraft remained. When Fukudome received the real casualty report, He bowed his head over the map in silence. A young officer wrote in his diary, "We still believed in spirit, but they believed in machines. And the machines won." 3 months before Formosa, on the 19th of June 1944, the Battle of the Marianas had already foretold that outcome. The Americans called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The battle took place over the Philippine Sea, between two forces of equal size, 450 Hellcats of Task Force 50, 8 against 450 Japanese aircraft under Admiral Hisaburo Ozawa. According to the U.S. Navy Fighter Director Report 1944, ship radar detected the first Japanese attack wave from 150 miles away. Within 12 minutes, the Hellcats had climbed to the ideal position, the sun behind them, at an altitude of 25,000 feet. In the control tower, Admiral Mark Mitcher calmly watched the ink lines shift across the plotting board. When an officer asked if reserve squadrons should be launched, he replied, "No need, they're enough." In the sky, Hellcat formations arced forward to intercept the Japanese. "We saw them coming like a swarm of bees, hundreds of them," recalled Lieutenant David McCampbell. "I pulled the trigger, and the sky turned into burning metal." The battle lasted 12 minutes, ending with 42 Japanese planes crashing into the sea. Over the course of the day, 346 Japanese aircraft were shot down, along with 50 more from land bases, while the US lost 30 planes. One Hellcat pilot described it, "They flew straight into our guns as if they were training." Japan did not merely lose airplanes, it lost the ability to train replacements. After the Marianas, 70% of its remaining pilots were raw recruits. In his report to Tokyo, Admiral Ozawa admitted, "The enemy is not human, but a system. They fight like an assembly line, while we fight from memory." When the campaign ended, the US not only controlled Marianas airspace, but had also opened the gate to strategic bombing runs against Tokyo. But the peak of collapse came at the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, the largest naval engagement in modern history. Over the Philippine Sea, the Hellcat proved that the sky now belonged entirely to America. On the morning of October 24, VF-15 Squadron launched from the USS Essex, led by Commander David McCampbell, who had already set records at the Marianas. According to the after-action report, VF-15, 1944, McCampbell led 7 Hellcats against 60 Japanese aircraft approaching the fleet. The engagement lasted 90 minutes. "We plunged into them like a hammer through glass," McCampbell wrote in his log. He shot down 9 planes, while Lieutenant Roy Rushing downed 6 more. When their ammunition ran out, they still had fuel for another 40 minutes, but there were no enemies left to fight. Not a single Hellcat was lost. According to U.S. Navy Air Combat Intelligence, 1944, the kill ratio in this battle was 15-0, an unprecedented figure in the history of air warfare. McCampbell was later awarded the Medal of Honor, and the name Ace of Aces became forever tied to the Hellcat. Aboard the carrier, as McCampbell landed, engineers recorded every bullet fired and every hole in the fuselage. The data was sent directly to the Naval Analysis Bureau to update performance charts. One technical officer murmured, "We win because we measure." The Hellcat was not merely a weapon, it was a sensor within an entire war system. Each victory was a report, each bullet a data point. Over Leyte, as the Hellcat seized total air dominance, aerial combat had evolved into something else: air control. Hellcat squadrons flew along radar grids, each section of sky defined and managed from the fleet below. Officers called it the grid. According to the U.S. Naval Air Doctrine Manual, 1944, every time radar detected a target, a vector pair was transmitted to lock position and calculate the probability of successful interception. There was no longer the notion of dogfight, but rather allocation of kill probability. The Japanese could not adapt. They still flew in traditional formations, believing that skill and spirit could turn the tide. But such values had no place in a war run by statistics. A pilot who survived later wrote in his diary, "We fought with faith, they fought with coordinates." By the end of 1944, aerial combat was no longer balanced. The Hellcat controlled the entire western Pacific sky, according to the U.S. Navy Statistical Summary, December 1944. In just 6 months, the Hellcat shot down 2,345 Japanese aircraft while losing 239, an average kill ratio of 8 to 1. The disparity was no longer surprising, it was the natural result of a perfectly functioning system. In the war rooms of Japan's Ministry of the Navy in Tokyo, generals stared silently at maps. Airfields once filled with Zeros now stood with a few rusting shells. From Marianas to Leyte, recorded the Imperial Navy Staff Report, 1945. We have lost the sky. There was no path back. As the sun set over the Philippine Sea, the waves reflected the red glow of dozens of smouldering fires. On the deck of the USS Essex, McCampbell removed his flight cap and looked up at the quiet sky. He knew he had witnessed the end of an era. Across the ocean, at deserted air bases, young Japanese pilots still waited for takeoff orders. They did not yet know that the enemy awaiting them was no longer human, but an entire system. And in that quiet sky over Leyte, the Empire's last illusion of air power burned away. As the Pacific entered 1945, aerial warfare was no longer a contest of personal skill and warrior virtue, but a survival equation built on data. The Battle of Okinawa, stretching from April to June, was a brutal testament to that transformation. According to the U.S. Navy Operational Summary, 1945, Hellcat squadrons flew 38,038 sorties, claimed 2,351 enemy aircraft destroyed, lost 249 planes, achieving a 9.51 kill ratio, and intercepted roughly 80% of suicide attacks aimed at the fleet. Those numbers were not rhetoric. They were the outcome of calculations, statistical tables, and continuous learning cycles. On carrier decks, as night fell, statistical officers sat under dim lamps, sorting reports into boxes, running comparisons, and sending conclusions back to command. Each sortie became a record. Each record became data for refining training, adjusting tactics, and updating force distribution charts. The Hellcat had become the system's sensor, returning numbers used to measure the survival probability of an operation. We measured, and then we struck. An operations officer wrote in his combat journal. Meanwhile, across the battle line, despair took shape as another set of numbers. The architect of the kamikaze program, Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, posed the question in cold mathematics. If we attack conventionally, the probability of success is near 0%. If we attack suicidally, the probability rises to about 30%. That sentence, cited in post-war archives, shows that the decision to return to suicidal tactics was not an emotional outburst, but the logical conclusion of cost-benefit calculation in a military system drained of resources. Onishi offered that formula amid shortages of fuel, training, and time. He admitted that only statistical meaning could justify the deaths of thousands. The result was a condensed, ritualized form of suicide training brief, mechanical, maintained through oral instruction and minimal schedules. Kamikaze pilots boarded their planes with 40 to 50 flight hours, many never having fired a live round. Those hours were not a transformation into fully trained combat aviators, but a sequence of lessons on approaching targets, keeping a straight trajectory, and securing the bomb to ensure the final dive stayed on course. This training reality, recorded in later recovered reports, revealed that most participants had no real combat experience. They were numbers inserted into a chart awaiting use. Lack of training went hand in hand with the collapse of manpower supply. At the beginning of the war, the Imperial Japanese Navy had about 18,000 experienced naval aviators, men who had survived multiple campaigns and logged countless hours in the air. By August 1945, that number had shrunk catastrophically to fewer than 100 combat-experienced pilots, according to post-war statistics. This decline did not come from a single catastrophic battle, but from 3 years of constant attrition, the exhaustion of veterans in major engagements, and the decision to expend what remained in suicide missions. When an organization resorts to suicide as a tactical tool, it means every other option has been spent. In Okinawa, the Hellcat operated at a relentless pace. Squadrons launched sorties almost back-to-back, rotating shifts, repairing aircraft on deck, and returning to the air just hours after landing. Recovery teams worked through the night. Technical reports logged repair times and re-sortie rates, every figure feeding into operational decisions. The system allowed a damaged Hellcat to return to service within 24 hours, a stark contrast to Japan's fragile maintenance network. Each returning pilot brought direct data: enemy approach patterns, dive angles, ammunition expenditure inputs for updating force allocation algorithms for the next sortie. What happened at sea mirrored what happened inside the minds of pilots. For many Japanese, a suicide attack was seen as an act of honor but also as an act of cruelty. Some escaped fear by imagining their deaths would become legend. Others looked at the data and understood they had been chosen by probability. In post-war testimony, one former officer recalled a dim room, the sound of papers turning, then said hoarsely, "They called it a sacred mission, but on paper, we were quantities to be used." That micro-reaction, a blink under light, a trembling hand reaching for a glass, softened the coldness of numbers but could not erase the fact that statistics had determined fate. While Japan calculated probability by sending men out as a last resort, America refined the art of protecting the survivors. The Hellcat was modified to reduce pilot risk. Post-war data showed Hellcat pilots' survival rates far exceeded their opponents. Training, production, and maintenance were tightly integrated, each link strengthening the network, and the stronger the network, the more experienced pilots could be trained, retained, and redeployed. The Americans paid in industry and resources, but they earned their return in lives. When the Okinawa campaign ended, Japanese generals stood before maps where casualty figures lay like verdicts. Each data cell marked an abandoned airfield, each line a name that never returned. Post-war reports stated that Okinawa was where the technology of war reached its most ruthless and pragmatic expression, where probability equations were applied to the human body. And in the end, when the numbers were packed away, when the reports were sent to Tokyo and Washington and filed into archives, one fact became clear. War had become an information system, a stream of data determining who lived and who died. The pilots who had once been samurai were now reduced to columns of figures, and within those calculations, humanity was distorted. We had the math. An American officer wrote later, they had the courage. In the wind across the ship's bow, in the engines fading on the deck, both existed at once, but on the map of war, only one decided the outcome. And in that accounting, survival became a function of systems, not saints. In September 1945, the final guns fell silent. As the Japanese Empire signed its surrender aboard the USS Missouri, the F6F Hellcats still patrolled above, their R-2,800 engines humming softly, a quiet affirmation that their era had fulfilled its mission. According to the U.S. War Production Board Final Report 1946, Grumman built 12,275 Hellcats in just 30 months, achieving an average rate of 1 aircraft per hour at its Bethpage, New York, plant. That figure was not merely an industrial feat, but the outcome of an unprecedented organizational philosophy, using systems to manufacture victory. In the same period, all of Japan produced only 5,100 fighter aircraft of every type, most assembled in warehouses by untrained labor. The Bethpage plant became a symbol of an industry capable of reproducing victory like a colossal assembly line. By day, light filtered through the glass roof, glinting on aluminum fuselages awaiting paint. By night, the lights stayed on, the shift whistles sounded, and workers rotated through 3 continuous shifts. An engineer recorded in his diary, "We weren't just assembling airplanes, we were assembling an era." The Hellcat was born from the logic of production lines, not from inspiration, and when the war ended, it stood as proof of a total organizational method, something Japan had never managed to achieve. Across the Pacific, after the surrender, Japanese engineers were permitted to inspect intact Hellcats. In the archives of the U.S. Naval Technical Mission to Japan, 1946. The report led by Jiro Horikoshi stated, the R2800 Pratt & Whitney engine has 2,814 standardized components, each interchangeable with any other engine of the same model. This was the concept of interchangeability, which Japanese industry had not yet mastered. By contrast, the Nakajima Sake engine of the Zero had to be assembled manually, with parts filed, cut, and fitted individually for each unit. No two engines were identical. Every repair required skilled craftsmen, and each minor flaw could ground an entire aircraft. Horikoshi added, "We built mechanical warriors. They built self-operating structures." That difference became history's verdict. Japan did not lose for lack of courage, but for failure in industrial thought. When American engineers spoke of the Hellcat, they did not call it an airplane, but a system platform. Each Hellcat carried data, and that data was used to improve the next. Standardization allowed the United States to produce, repair, train, and replace faster than any adversary. Japan, proud of its meticulous craftsmanship, became imprisoned by that very precision trapped within the limits of productivity. According to the Japan Science and Engineering Review, 1948, 70% of zero maintenance time was consumed by hand-adjusting, non-standardized components. In the post-war years, Jiro Horikoshi helped rebuild Japan's civil aviation industry. He did not deny the brilliance of his American counterparts, but saw them as men who had advanced a generation ahead. When asked about the Zero's failure, he said in a 1951 interview, "We built airplanes for 1,941. They built systems for 1,945. That remark was later cited in many studies of industrial philosophy. The Hellcat was not aerodynamically perfect, but it was perfect in its creation cycle from blueprint, material, and assembly to operation and recovery. In America, the Hellcat was soon replaced by the F6F Bearcat and F9F Panther, yet its legacy did not vanish. The entire Hellcat production process became the model for post-war manufacturing. According to the National Defense Manufacturing Survey, 1950, 80% of engineers who had worked on the Hellcat program transitioned to jet aircraft and civilian industrial projects, bringing with them the philosophy of the statistical assembly line, the use of empirical data to guide production. As the American economy entered its boom in the 1950 seconds, many economists argued that the Hellcat had demonstrated the central principle of the post-war industrial age. Power lies not in the product itself, but in the ability to reproduce the product. In Japan, the psychological and philosophical aftermath lasted for years. Surviving pilots opened training schools, wrote memoirs, and sought to understand how an entire aviation civilization had collapsed so swiftly. During a 1959 symposium in Tokyo, Saburo Sakai, once a living legend, spoke in a low voice. "The Zero was a warrior. The Hellcat was a system. We brought swords to a gunfight." The quote, recorded in the Japan Veterans Journal, 1962, became a symbol of a generation's awakening. It was not merely a statement of defeat, but a confession, a cultural reckoning with the reality of organized science. In 1962, at the U.S. Japan Naval Veterans Conference in Hawaii, the two sides met again in reconciliation. The conference hall glowed with soft light. Scale models of the Hellcat and Zero stood side by side. The film projector clicked steadily, showing images of the skies over Marianas and Leyte, shimmering with the metallic and smoky hues of war. When the moderator asked who among them had fought face to face, several hands rose. Sakai looked at the American beside him, smiled faintly, and said slowly in English, "We all fought for our systems." The room fell silent for a few seconds, then erupted in applause. Afterward, many attendees wrote that it was the first time they truly felt the war had ended, not when the weapons went silent, but when people understood that the real difference lay in how they organized their world. The Hellcat was the product of assembly lines, of science and statistics. The Zero was the product of craftsmanship and faith. One survived through time, the other lived on in memory. On the memorial plaque at the National Air and Space Museum, beneath the model of the Hellcat, A small inscription reads, "It was the weapon of a system, not a man." That line stands as the verdict of a century, for after the war, when humanity counted its losses and triumphs, the numbers spoke not only of destruction, but of the evolution of thought. And as a closing reflection, Sakai once said in his final interview before his death, "War never truly ends. It only changes form from steel and bullets to data and production lines." The Hellcat taught us that. In the dim light of the museum, where the Hellcat stands beside the Zero, one can almost hear the echo of an imagined engine. And in that quiet hum, the age of the machine finally took its seat in history's courtroom. Thank you for following this journey where numbers, people, and machines have retold an unforgettable era in the history of aviation. We are committed to continuing to bring you exceptional stories that revive the battles that shaped the modern world. Don't forget to subscribe to follow more of these historic battles.